The pack meeting had been called to decide Lila's fate, though everyone already knew what the outcome would be before the first word was spoken. At 17, she had aged out of the meager protections afforded to orphaned pups, and Alpha Marcus Steelheart was eager to rid himself of what he saw as a burden the Ironwood pack could no longer afford to carry. The girl has no bloodline, no connections, no skills that benefit the pack, Marcus declared from his position at the head of the Great Hall, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. For 17 years, we have fed and sheltered her out of charity, but charity has its limits. She brings nothing to our pack except another mouth to feed. Leela stood in the center of the gathered wolves, surrounded by faces that ranged from indifferent to openly hostile. These were people who had known her since she was a frightened 5-year-old, brought to the pack after her parents were killed in a rogue attack. They had watched her grow up on the margins of their society, always present but never truly belonging, always hoping for acceptance that never quite came. "What would you have us do with her?" asked Beta Thomas Grimfang, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Cast her out to survive as a rogue? She has no training in wilderness survival, no combat skills, no understanding of how to live outside pack protection. That is precisely what I propose," Marcus replied, without a hint of concern for the life he was discussing so casually. "She is not our blood, not our responsibility. Let her make her own way in the world, as countless other rogues have done before her." The casual cruelty in his voice made Lila's heart clench with familiar pain. But she had learned long ago not to show weakness in front of the pack. Tears and pleas would only confirm their belief that she was too soft, too weak, too emotional to deserve their continued protection. "Alpha Marcus," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the terror that clawed at her throat. "I have served this pack faithfully for 12 years. I've worked in the kitchens, tended the injured, watched the young pups, cleaned the common areas. I have given everything I had to give. And we gave you food and shelter in return," Marcus replied dismissively. "The debt is settled. You owe us nothing, and we owe you nothing. That is the nature of charity, girl. It is given freely and can be withdrawn just as freely." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled pack, though Lila noticed that some of the older wolves looked uncomfortable with the proceedings. These were people who remembered her parents, who had known her mother's gentle healing touch and her father's courage in battle. But even their discomfort wasn't enough to make them speak against their alpha's decision. "Please," Lila said, hating how small her voice sounded in the vast hall. "I have nowhere else to go. This is the only home I've ever known. Surely there must be some role I can fill, some way I can continue to contribute." "You are not pack," snarled Gamma Rebecca Blackclaw, her voice dripping with the disdain that had defined her interactions with Lila for as long as either could remember. "You never were pack, despite our alpha's generous allowance of your presence among us. Pack takes care of pack. You are neither blood nor chosen family, which means you are nothing." The words hit Lila like physical blows, each one driving home the reality that she had spent 17 years trying to ignore. She wasn't family to these people, wasn't even really a member of their community. She was a charity case that had outlived its usefulness, an obligation they were finally free to discharge. "The decision is made," Alpha Marcus declared with finality that brooked no argument. "Lila Ravencrest will leave Ironwood territory by sunset tomorrow. She may take basic survival supplies, but nothing that belongs to the pack. Any attempt to return will be met with lethal force." As the pack began to disperse, their duty discharged and their consciences apparently clear, Lila found herself standing alone in the center of the Great Hall. The enormity of what had just happened crashed over her like a tide of ice water. By tomorrow night, she would be entirely on her own, cast out into a world that was notoriously hostile to lone wolves. "Lila," called a soft voice from near the hall's entrance. She turned to see Elena Moonwhisper, one of the few pack members who had ever shown her genuine kindness. At 45, Elena was old enough to remember Lila's parents and wise enough to understand that bloodline wasn't everything. "Elena," Lila replied, grateful for any friendly face in the aftermath of her public rejection. "I suppose you're here to say goodbye." "I'm here to give you something that might help you survive what's coming," Elena said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. She pressed a small leather pouch into Lila's hands, along with what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "Money I've saved over the years, and directions to a place where lone wolves sometimes gather. It's not much, but it's something." Tears finally began to stream down Lila's cheeks as she realized that at least one person in the pack genuinely cared about her welfare. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the gifts like lifelines. "I'll never forget your kindness." "There's something else," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Your parents. They weren't just ordinary pack members. Your mother was a healer whose abilities bordered on the supernatural, and your father was a warrior whose strength was legendary even among alphas. Their bloodline carries power, Lila, real power. Don't let anyone tell you that you're nothing." Before Lila could ask what she meant, Elena melted back into the crowd of departing pack members, leaving her alone with questions that had no immediate answers. But the older woman's words planted a seed of hope in her chest, a possibility that maybe she was more than the unwanted orphan everyone believed her to be. The rest of the day passed in a blur of packing her few possessions and saying goodbye to the handful of people who had shown her any kindness over the years. The pack's children, especially, seemed confused by her departure, having grown accustomed to her presence in their daily lives. That evening, as Lila lay in her small room for the last time, she found herself thinking about the map Elena had given her. According to the notations, there was a place called Haven's Rest, about 3 days' walk into the neutral territories, where lone wolves and other displaced supernatural beings sometimes found temporary refuge. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than wandering aimlessly through wilderness that contained threats she couldn't even imagine. If she could make it to Haven's Rest, maybe she could figure out what to do next. As dawn broke over the Ironwood Pack territory, Lila shouldered her modest pack and walked toward the boundary markers that had defined her world for 12 years. Behind her lay everything familiar, everyone she had ever known. Every memory that had shaped her into who she was. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the kind of freedom that came only to those who had nothing left to lose. She had taken perhaps a dozen steps beyond the pack's borders when she heard it, a howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carrying notes of loneliness and power that made her soul resonate with recognition. Somewhere in the wilderness ahead, another lone wolf was announcing his presence to the world. Sheila had no way of knowing that her exile would lead her directly to the most dangerous and fascinating creature she would ever encounter, or that the howl she was hearing belonged to someone who would change everything about her understanding of what it meant to be truly free. All she knew was that for the first time in her life, she was walking towards something instead of away from it. And that felt like the beginning of everything rather than the end. Subscribe to our channel to discover what incredible destiny awaits Lila in the wilderness and who the mysterious lone wolf really is. Will she find the family she's always searched for? Don't miss the next chapter where legends come to life. Hit that subscribe button now. 3 days of traveling through wilderness that seemed determined to test every limit of her endurance had taught Lila that survival as a lone wolf required skills she had never been taught and instincts she was only beginning to develop. The map Elena had given her proved invaluable, guiding her along paths that avoided the most dangerous territories, while leading toward the haven she desperately hoped would provide temporary safety. But it was the constant sense of being watched that truly unsettled her. From the moment she had crossed into the neutral lands, Lila had felt eyes tracking her movement through the forest, a presence that moved parallel to her path without ever showing itself directly. Every survival instinct she possessed screamed that she was being hunted, yet no attack ever came. On the 3rd night, As she huddled beside a carefully concealed fire in a small cave she had discovered, the watching presence finally revealed itself. A figure emerged from the tree line with fluid grace that spoke of supernatural power, far beyond anything she had ever encountered, moving toward her hiding place with predatory purpose that should have terrified her. Instead, Lila found herself strangely calm as she got her first clear look at the lone wolf who had been shadowing her journey. He was tall, probably in his early 30s, with dark hair that seemed to absorb moonlight and eyes that burned silver in the firelight. But it was the aura of controlled violence that surrounded him that truly commanded attention. This was someone who had survived things that would have broken lesser beings. You're either very brave or very foolish to be traveling alone through territory that most experienced rogues avoid, he said, his voice carrying notes of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Which is it, little wolf?" "Desperate," Lila replied honestly, her hand moving instinctively toward the small knife Elena had included with her supplies. "I was cast out from the Ironwood Pack 3 days ago. I'm trying to reach Haven's Rest." The stranger's expression shifted slightly, something that might have been recognition flickering in his silver eyes. "Ironwood Pack," he repeated thoughtfully. "Alpha Marcus Steelheart's territory. What did you do to earn exile from that particular collection of self-righteous cowards?" The casual insult directed at her former pack should have offended her, but instead Lila found herself almost smiling at his blunt assessment. "I existed," she said with bitter honesty. "I was an orphaned pup they took in out of charity, and when I aged out of their protection, they decided I was no longer worth feeding." "Ah," the stranger said, settling onto a fallen log across from her fire, with movements that suggested he felt completely safe, despite being in the presence of an armed unknown. "The burden of unwanted charity. I'm familiar with that particular form of rejection." Something in his tone suggested personal experience with abandonment, though Lila couldn't imagine anyone being foolish enough to cast out someone who radiated such dangerous competence. "You were exiled too?" "Not exiled," he replied with a smile that was all sharp edges and dark humor. "I chose to leave before they could work up the courage to try. There's a difference between being unwanted and being unwelcome. I was definitely the latter." He studied her with eyes that seemed to see far more than most people revealed, taking in her travel-worn appearance and the careful way she held herself ready for flight or fight. "You're heading in the wrong direction for Haven's Rest," he observed. "The safe path is at least a day's walk further north. Continue on your current route, and you'll walk directly into Shadow Beast territory." Terror shot through Lila's system at the mention of creatures that existed in the nightmares of every supernatural being. Shadow beasts were corrupted spirits that fed on life force, turning their victims into empty husks before moving on to the next prey. "The map Elena gave me shows this as a safe passage," she said, pulling out the carefully drawn guide that had been her lifeline for 3 days. The stranger leaned forward to examine the map, and his expression grew grim as he traced the route Elena had marked. "This map is at least 5 years old," he said with certainty that spoke of intimate knowledge of the territory. "The Shadow Beast incursion happened 3 years ago, making this entire valley a dead zone. Your friend gave you directions that will get you killed." The realization that she had been walking towards certain death for 3 days made Lila's legs go weak with belated terror. "She didn't know," she whispered, though doubt crept into her voice as she remembered Elena's furtive behavior and careful timing. "Maybe," the stranger said, though his tone suggested he had his own theories about Elena's motives. "Or maybe someone wanted to ensure that the unwanted Orphan never had the chance to become inconvenient in other ways." The suggestion that Elena might have deliberately sent her toward danger was almost too painful to consider. But it would explain why no one else in the pack had seemed concerned about her ability to survive in the wilderness. Perhaps her exile wasn't just about resources and charity. Perhaps there were other reasons why the Ironwood Pack wanted her gone permanently. "What's your name?" she asked suddenly, needing to focus on something other than the possibility that she had been betrayed by the one person she had trusted. Kieran Blackthorne, he replied, and the name sent recognition shooting through her consciousness like lightning. I can see from your expression that you've heard the stories. That was a massive understatement. Kieran Blackthorne was a legend among supernatural beings, though the nature of that legend depended on who was doing the telling. To most packs, he was the ghost wolf, a lone predator who could appear anywhere without warning and disappear just as quickly. To rogues and outcasts, he was something closer to a guardian angel, someone who protected those who had no one else to turn to. They say you're the most dangerous lone wolf alive, Lila said, though her voice carried more fascination than fear. They say you've killed alphas who threatened innocence, toppled corrupt pack hierarchies, and survived challenges that would destroy ordinary wolves. They say a lot of things, Kieran replied, with dry amusement. Most of them are exaggerated, though not all. I do have a reputation for interfering when powerful beings abuse those who can't fight back. He stood with fluid grace that confirmed every story she had ever heard about his supernatural abilities. Which brings me to why I've been following you for 3 days. Lila Ravencrest, daughter of Marcus and Sarah Ravencrest, last heir to a bloodline that certain people would prefer to see ended permanently. The revelation hit Lila like a physical blow, reordering everything she thought she knew about her origins and her exile. What are you talking about? My parents were ordinary pack members. They died in a rogue attack when I was 5. Your parents were Marcus and Sarah Ravencrest, members of one of the most powerful supernatural bloodlines in existence, Kieran corrected, with certainty that left no room for doubt. They were murdered by agents working for someone who wanted their genetic legacy eliminated. You've been living under a false identity for 12 years, hidden among wolves who had no idea what kind of power flows through your veins. The world seemed to tilt around Lila as she processed implications that changed everything about her understanding of herself and her situation. That's impossible, she whispered, though even as she spoke the words, pieces began falling into place in her mind. Elena's insistence that her bloodline carried power, the pack's eagerness to be rid of her despite her useful skills, the convenient timing of her exile just as she reached adulthood. The Ravencrest bloodline produces natural leaders, Kieran continued, his voice gentle, despite the earth-shaking nature of his revelations. Wolves whose presence inspires loyalty and whose judgment can unite even the most fractured communities. That kind of power is threatening to established hierarchies, especially when it emerges in someone with no political connections or family protection. Alpha Marcus knew? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Alpha Marcus orchestrated your parents' deaths and has been working to ensure you never learn about your heritage, Kieran confirmed with grim satisfaction. But his timeline got accelerated when scouts reported my presence in the area. He needed you gone before I could make contact and reveal the truth about who you really are. Rage began building in Lila's chest, not the helpless fury of the powerless, but something far more dangerous. For the first time in her life, she felt the stirrings of what Elena had called her birthright, authority that didn't need to be granted or acknowledged, power that commanded respect through simple presence. Why are you telling me this? She asked, though her voice now carried harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. What do you want from me? Kieran smiled, and this time the expression held warmth rather than dark amusement. I want to offer you something that Alpha Marcus never would. Choice. You can continue to Haven's Rest, disappear into the anonymous community of displaced rogues, and live quietly under your false identity. Or you can embrace who you really are, and let me help you claim the power that is rightfully yours. And if I choose power, then we return to the Ironwood Pack, and you challenge Alpha Marcus for leadership, Kieran replied without hesitation. By ancient law, any wolf with legitimate claim to power can demand trial by combat for the right to rule. Win, and you become alpha of the pack that cast you out. Lose, and you die knowing you fought for what was yours." The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning two completely different futures. On one side lay safety, anonymity, and the quiet life of someone who had chosen survival over justice. On the other side lay danger, responsibility, and the chance to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. "There's a third option," Kieran added quietly, his silver eyes holding hers with intensity that made her heart flutter in unexpected ways. "You could accept my claim as your mate and protector. Let me teach you to use your power safely while keeping you safe from those who would exploit or destroy it." The suggestion sent shockwaves through Lila's consciousness, offering not just protection, but partnership with the most feared and respected lone wolf in the supernatural world. It was an incredible honor, a gesture of recognition that went far beyond mere alliance. "You would do that?" she asked, hardly daring to believe that someone of his stature would offer himself as protector to an exiled orphan. "You would bind yourself to someone with no pack, no resources, no proven abilities." "I would bind myself to the rightful heir of the Ravencrest bloodline," Kieran corrected gently. "To someone whose power will reshape the supernatural world once it's properly awakened. To the woman who could become the greatest alpha of her generation if she chooses to claim her destiny." As Lila stared into the silver fire of his eyes, she felt something awakening in her chest that had nothing to do with magical heritage and everything to do with the recognition of finding someone who saw her true value. For the first time in her life, she was being offered not charity but partnership, not protection but power, not survival but the chance to thrive. The choice was hers to make. But as dawn began to break over the wilderness that had become the birthplace of her true identity, she already knew what her answer would be. Subscribe to our channel to discover Lila's incredible decision and witness her transformation from forgotten orphan to powerful alpha. Will she choose safety or power? How will her bond with Kieran reshape both their destinies? Don't miss the epic next chapter. Hit that subscribe button now! Lila's decision to accept Kieran's offer as her mate and protector had been easier than she expected, though the reality of what that meant proved far more complex than either of them had anticipated. The mating bond between wolves was sacred, creating connections that went beyond mere partnership into something that touched the very essence of supernatural existence. "Are you certain about this?" Kieran asked for the third time as they prepared for the bonding ritual that would link their souls permanently. "Once we complete this, there's no going back. You'll be bound to a lone wolf with more enemies than allies, a reputation that makes peaceful coexistence nearly impossible." "I'm certain," Lila replied with conviction that surprised her with its strength. "For 17 years I've been nobody's priority, nobody's choice, nobody's family. You're offering me partnership, protection, and the chance to become who I was meant to be. How could I not be certain?" They stood in a clearing that seemed to pulse with ancient magic, surrounded by standing stones that predated the formation of modern pack territories. According to Kieran, this was one of the old places, where supernatural beings had performed sacred rituals for thousands of years before politics and territory disputes divided their world into competing factions. "The bonding ritual will do more than create emotional connection," Kieran explained, his voice carrying notes of both anticipation and concern. "It will awaken the dormant power in your Ravencrest bloodline. That awakening can be intense. You might experience visions, memories that aren't your own, awareness of abilities you've never accessed before." "Will it hurt?" Lila asked, though her tone suggested the answer wouldn't change her decision. "Probably," Kieran admitted with the honesty that had already become one of his most attractive qualities. "Power awakening is rarely comfortable, especially when it's been suppressed for as long as yours has been. But I'll be with you through every moment of it, sharing the experience through our bond." As the moon reached its zenith above the ancient clearing, Kieran began the ritual with words spoken in the old tongue, a language that seemed to resonate with the very stones around them. Lila felt magic stirring in response to his voice. Power that called to something deep within her genetic memory. When he took her hands in his, the connection that formed between them was unlike anything she had ever imagined. It started as warmth flowing from his skin to hers, but quickly became something far more profound. She could feel his emotions, his memories, his absolute commitment to protecting her regardless of what it might cost him. But it was when the Ravencrest power began to awaken that the ritual truly became transformative. Energy that had been dormant for 17 years suddenly erupted through her system like liquid fire, rewriting her understanding of what it meant to be supernatural. Visions flashed through her consciousness, her real parents fighting desperately to protect their infant daughter. Alpha Marcus orchestrating their murder, years of careful manipulation designed to keep her weak and ignorant. "I can see it all," she gasped, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there moments before. "The conspiracy, the lies, the years of keeping me powerless, while they consolidated control over territory that should have been mine by right." "Let the anger fuel your awakening," Kieran encouraged, his own power flowing through their bond to help stabilize the chaotic energy coursing through her system. "But don't let it consume you. Rage can awaken power, but wisdom must guide how that power is used." The transformation continued for hours, each wave of awakening bringing new awareness of abilities she had never suspected she possessed. Natural leadership that could inspire loyalty in even the most rebellious subordinates. Tactical instincts that could analyze complex situations and identify optimal solutions. Most remarkably, an empathic connection to other supernatural beings that allowed her to sense their deepest motivations and fears. When the ritual finally reached its conclusion, Leela found herself fundamentally changed in ways that went far beyond mere magical awakening. She felt complete for the first time in her life, no longer the unwanted orphan, but someone whose very presence commanded respect and attention. "How do you feel?" Kieran asked, though his expression suggested he could already sense the answer through their newly formed bond. "Powerful," Lila replied, marveling at the confidence that flowed through her voice. "Like I've been living in a cage my entire life and someone just opened the door. Like I finally understand why everyone was so afraid of letting me grow up." She looked around the clearing with eyes that now perceived magical currents invisible to ordinary sight, seeing the ley lines that connected this sacred space to power sources throughout the supernatural world. "The Ironwood Pact sits on a convergence point," she realized with growing excitement. "That's why Alpha Marcus was so determined to eliminate my bloodline. My power is literally connected to the land itself, which means challenging him won't just be about personal justice," Kieran observed with satisfaction that spoke of plans finally coming to fruition. "It will be about restoring proper stewardship to territory that has been mismanaged for over a decade." The journey back toward Ironwood territory took 2 days, during which Lila learned to control and channel the power that now flowed through her like a second heartbeat. Kieran proved to be an excellent teacher, his years of experience with supernatural abilities providing guidance that helped her avoid the most dangerous pitfalls of newly awakened magic. But it was the growing connection between them that truly amazed her. The mating bond had created understanding that went beyond words, allowing them to communicate through shared emotions and intuitive awareness. She could feel his fierce protectiveness, his genuine admiration for her strength, and underneath it all, love that was all the more precious for being freely given rather than demanded or expected. "There's something you need to know before we reach the pack," Kieran said on their second morning of travel, his voice carrying notes of concern that made her pay careful attention. "Alpha Marcus isn't the only threat you'll face. Elena Moonwhisper, the woman who gave you the map and supplies, is his sister. Your exile wasn't an accident or an oversight. It was a carefully orchestrated attempt to ensure you died before your heritage could be discovered." The betrayal cut deeper than Lila had expected. though it also explained the nagging doubts she had felt about Elena's helpfulness. She sent me towards Shadow Beast territory, knowing I would die. She sent you towards Shadow Beast territory, hoping you would die, Kieran corrected gently. But she underestimated both your survival instincts and my determination to find you before it was too late. Her plan failed, which means she'll be desperate when we return. As they crested the hill that overlooked Ironwood Pack territory, Lila felt power surging through her in response to proximity to land that recognized her genetic claim. The convergence point Kieran had mentioned was clearly centered on the pack's main settlement, its energy calling to something fundamental in her Ravencrest heritage. "Are you ready for this?" Kieran asked, though his tone suggested he already knew she had moved beyond doubt into absolute certainty. "I've been ready my entire life," Lila replied, her voice carrying authority that would have been impossible just days before. "I just didn't know what I was preparing for." The pack sentries spotted them long before they reached the main settlement, their howls of alarm carrying news that sent the entire community into defensive positions. By the time Lila and Kieran reached the central square, hundreds of wolves had gathered to witness whatever confrontation was about to unfold. Alpha Marcus emerged from the pack house with Elena beside him, both of them radiating confidence that suggested they had been expecting this moment and preparing for it accordingly. But when Marcus got his first clear look at Lila, his expression shifted from smug certainty to something approaching terror. "Impossible," he breathed, staring at her with eyes that clearly recognized the awakened power she now carried. "The Ravencrest bloodline was eliminated." "I made certain of it. You eliminated 2 members of the Ravencrest bloodline," Lila corrected, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "But bloodlines aren't so easily destroyed, especially when they're connected to the land itself. I'm Lila Ravencrest, daughter of Marcus and Sarah, rightful heir to the power you stole through murder and deception." The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled pack, many of whom had known her parents and could now see the resemblance that had been hidden by years of careful suppression. Elena stepped forward with desperation clear in her features, but whatever she had been planning to say died when her eyes met Kieran's silver gaze. "The ghost wolf protects her," someone whispered from the crowd, and the words rippled through the gathering like wildfire. "Kieran Blackthorne has taken the Orphan as his mate. By ancient law," Lila declared, drawing on knowledge that seemed to flow from her awakened bloodline. "I challenge Alpha Marcus Steelheart for leadership of the Ironwood Pack, trial by combat, with pack leadership as the prize and death as the price of failure." The formal challenge hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing a moment that would reshape their community forever. Subscribe to our channel to witness the epic confrontation that will determine the fate of the Ironwood Pack. Will Lila's awakened power be enough to defeat the Alpha who murdered her parents? How will the Pack react when they learn the truth? Don't miss the incredible finale. Hit that subscribe button now. The trial by combat was set for sunset, giving both challengers time to prepare for a confrontation that would determine not just leadership of the Ironwood Pack, but the fate of everyone who had participated in the conspiracy to eliminate the Ravencrest bloodline. As word spread throughout the territory, wolves came from distant regions to witness what promised to be the most significant leadership challenge in generations. Lila spent the hours before the battle in meditation, drawing on the connection to the land that her awakened heritage had revealed. The convergence point beneath the pack's territory pulsed with energy that seemed to respond directly to her presence, offering strength and wisdom accumulated over centuries of supernatural activity. "You don't have to do this alone," Kieran reminded her as they prepared for the evening's confrontation. "The mating bond allows me to share my strength with you during combat. My experience, my instincts, my power, all of it is yours to draw upon." "I know," Lila replied, her voice carrying the calm confidence that had become her signature since the awakening. "But this is something I need to do as myself, with my own power." The pack needs to see that their rightful alpha can stand without depending on others for strength. She turned to face him, marveling again at how completely their bond had transformed her understanding of what partnership could mean. But having you there, knowing you'll catch me if I fall, that gives me courage I've never felt before. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the entire pack gathered in the great circle that had served as their ceremonial ground for over 2 centuries. The ancient stones that marked its boundaries hummed with anticipation, as if the land itself was eager to see justice finally served. Alpha Marcus entered the circle wearing ceremonial armor that spoke of confidence in his victory, his massive frame radiating the kind of supernatural power that had made him feared throughout the region. Behind him stood Elena and the other conspirators, their faces showing varying degrees of certainty about the outcome of the coming battle. But when Lila stepped into the circle, a hush fell over the assembled crowd that spoke of recognition deeper than mere political allegiance. The awakened Ravencrest power flowing through her created an aura of natural authority that even Marcus's most loyal supporters couldn't ignore. This wasn't just an orphaned girl challenging her former alpha. This was royalty reclaiming its rightful throne. "Before we begin," Lila announced, her voice carrying clearly to every wolf present, "let the truth be known to all. Alpha Marcus Steelheart murdered my parents, Marcus and Sarah Ravencrest, 17 years ago to steal leadership of this pack. Elena Moonwhisper, his sister, has spent years ensuring I remained ignorant of my heritage while working to orchestrate my death through calculated betrayal." The accusations sent shockwaves through the crowd, though many of the older wolves nodded with the recognition of pieces finally falling into place. Elena stepped forward with desperation clear in her features, but whatever defense she had planned died when confronted by the absolute certainty in Lila's voice. "These are lies," Marcus declared, though his voice carried less conviction than usual. "The girl seeks to claim power through deception and fantasy. She is nothing but an orphaned charity case who has been corrupted by association with rogue elements." "Then prove it," Lila challenged, drawing on authority that seemed to flow from the very stones beneath her feet. "Face me in honest combat and let the land itself judge which of us has the right to rule. The convergence point recognizes true leadership, Marcus. It will not support a false claimant." The formal beginning of trial by combat was marked by the tolling of ancient bells that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless leaders. As the sound faded, Lila and Marcus began circling each other with the careful movements of predators assessing their opponent's capabilities. Marcus struck first, his massive frame moving with speed that should have been impossible for someone his size. But Lila was no longer the powerless girl who had been cast out just days before. Her Ravencrest heritage guided her movements with instincts honed by generations of natural leaders, while her bond with Kieran provided tactical awareness that allowed her to anticipate attacks before they were fully formed. The battle that followed was less physical combat than manifestation of opposing philosophies made visible. Marcus fought with the brutal efficiency of someone accustomed to maintaining power through fear and intimidation. His attacks were designed to overwhelm and dominate, to break his opponent's will through sheer force. But Lila fought with something far more dangerous, righteous purpose backed by genuine authority. Her movements flowed like water around Marcus's attacks, while her counterstrikes carried power that seemed to draw directly from the land beneath their feet. Each blow she landed weakened not just his physical strength, but his connection to the territory he had claimed through treachery. "You feel it, don't you?" she said as their battle reached its crescendo, her voice carrying clearly despite their violent exertions. "The land pulling away from you, withdrawing its support because you were never meant to rule here. The convergence point recognizes its true guardian, Marcus. It knows you for the usurper you've always been." Marcus's response was a roar of fury that carried notes of desperation as he realized she was right. The supernatural energy he had drawn upon for years was indeed abandoning him, flowing instead toward the rightful heir who stood before him blazing with awakened power. His final attack was driven by pure desperation, a last attempt to destroy what he couldn't control. But as his claws descended toward Lila's heart, they met not flesh, but silver fire that erupted from her hands with force that sent him flying across the sacred circle. When Marcus hit the ancient stones that marked the circle's boundary, the sound that echoed across the territory wasn't just the impact of his body. It was the land itself rejecting his claim, severing the connections that had allowed him to maintain false authority for 17 years. "It's over," Lila declared, standing over the fallen Alpha with power radiating from her like visible heat. "Your reign of deception ends now." But instead of delivering the killing blow that tradition demanded, she extended her hand toward her defeated opponent. "I offer you what you never offered my parents, the choice between death and exile. Leave Ironwood territory forever and live out your days, knowing that mercy can be stronger than vengeance." The gesture sent murmurs of amazement through the assembled crowd, many of whom had expected summary execution of the deposed Alpha. But Lila's choice demonstrated something far more impressive than mere victory, wisdom that understood when to show strength through restraint. Marcus looked up at her with eyes that finally showed recognition of what he had tried so hard to destroy. "You truly are your parents' daughter," he said quietly. "They would be proud of the leader you've become." As he limped away from the territory that had defined his existence for nearly 2 decades, Lila turned to face the pack that now looked to her for guidance. The transformation from unwanted orphan to acknowledged Alpha was complete, but she understood that earning the title was only the beginning of the work ahead. "The Ironwood Pack has a choice to make," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had proven her right to rule. "We can continue as we have been, isolated and suspicious, hoarding power and resources while our neighbors struggle. Or we can become what we were meant to be, guardians of the convergence point, protectors of those who need sanctuary, leaders who inspire rather than intimidate." The howl of acceptance that rose from the assembled wolves was deafening in its enthusiasm, voices joining together in harmony that hadn't been heard in the territory for over a decade. They had their true Alpha at last, and with her came the promise of a future built on justice rather than fear. 6 months later, the Ironwood Pack had become a beacon of hope for supernatural beings throughout the region. Under Lila's leadership, they had established the first interspecies council in centuries, created sanctuary programs for orphaned and displaced beings, and developed trade relationships that benefited entire communities rather than just the elite. Kieran stood beside her on the balcony of the great house, watching as their territory bustled with activity that would have been impossible under Marcus's paranoid rule. Their bond had only grown stronger over the months, evolving from desperate alliance into genuine partnership that enhanced both their individual strengths. "Do you ever regret choosing this over a quiet life at Haven's Rest?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Lila smiled, her hand finding his as she contemplated a future that seemed brighter than anything she had ever dared imagine. "Never," she replied with absolute certainty. "This is who I was always meant to be. The orphan they cast aside has found her true family, and together we're building something that will endure for generations." As the sun set over territory that thrived under righteous leadership, the former exile reflected on a journey that had led from rejection to recognition, from powerlessness to purpose, from solitude to the kind of love that made all struggles worthwhile. The lone wolf had indeed taken the orphan as his mate, but in doing so, he had helped her discover that she was never really alone. She had simply been waiting for the right moment to claim the family, the power, and the destiny that had always been hers by right. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey from exile to empowerment. If this story of finding your true strength and purpose through love and partnership touched your heart, Please subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales that prove our greatest challenges often lead to our greatest triumphs. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that being unwanted by the wrong people can lead to being treasured by the right ones. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell to never miss our latest supernatural adventures.